Hey guys, what's going on? So this is a review of Remnant from the Ashes. And Remnant from the Ashes was a lot of fun, I have to admit. There were a lot of things to enjoy about playing Remnant from the Ashes. There was pretty solid graphics, definitely stylized art, really difficult boss encounters, a lot of really cool weapon upgrades and RPG elements to the game. I think, above all else, the difficulty stands out for most people. The hike that it takes to get to the end of the game, and knowing specifically what needs to be upgraded and how to go about making sure that your guy is as strong as possible going into some of the later fights in the game. It really creates this just grueling battle, which is why the game has been compared to games like Dark Souls and Bloodborne and things of that nature. But I think if we review the game across a bunch of different areas, that we can really come to a concrete definition of how good is Remnant from the Ashes really. So if we look at graphics, difficulty, RPG mechanics, gameplay, sound quality, and just the overall design of the game, I think we can go through a few different bullet points here and we can really nail down what my thoughts and opinions are on the game, and then we can, obviously discuss further and formulate other opinions, as time goes on and you think about the game a little more. Anyways, I think what's most important for most people that I know is you look at a game and you're like, okay, those graphics are sick, that combat system looks pretty cool, how's the gameplay? And those are like the top three things that people look at, is the way the game is played, the RPG mechanics, and then the graphics. I think those are the selling points. Now, I think if you're a veteran gamer, I think that the audio goes into it, the difficulty, more stuff goes into it if you're more of a stickler and you're a hardcore gamer. But for the average gamer, I think graphics, RPG mechanics, and gameplay are the top three selling points. Now, this is where I want to start, is with the graphics. I think the overall look and feel of the game is pretty solid. I think they did a really good job of keeping the game to look a certain way consistently throughout the game. They had that same stylized look. They didn't go for ultra real graphics. You can even tell your guy's slightly cartoony even when he's got his badass gear going around. He's wearing bones on, his shoulder pads have bones and his helmet has bones on it. It's like your guy's like a total destroyer, slayer type guy, but he still looks cartoony, so you never get that like crazy feel about the game, and it gives it a very stylized look, which is what a lot of people are going for. I think they keep that theme going throughout the game the entire time, and it looks really solid. So I have no gripes with the graphics in the game whatsoever. There are a couple moments in the game where you look at some of the objects and it looks like they put a little bit less time into the textures and the actual creations of the assets that are in the game themselves. But aside from a couple of those moments, I think overall the graphics are pretty solid. So I would give them an A- on graphics, just because there were a couple of times where I'm like, wow, they didn't put any effort into that. But overall, for the stylized look they went for, I'd pretty much give them an A. Graphics, when you were in a dense area with a lot of different objects in an area, the frames per second could dip a lot. So specifically what I'm remembering here is when I was in Corsus. There was an area with a lot of tiki huts all over the place, and machines churning, and water, and enemies all over the place, and enemies within enemies. And the actual frames per second when you would get into an intense combat situation would totally falter. And it would get to the point where your frames per second would dip into probably this single and like very low end double digits. And you would barely even be able to play the game. And I specifically played on an Xbox One, and I noticed it was really bad. But other reviews for people playing on the PC and on the PS4 all suffered similar situations when they were in the game as well. So That has more to do with the way that they're rendering the objects in the scene and less to do with the actual device that's playing the game. That over time can be patched, and they can reduce, the draw calls and all the different things on the camera so they don't have as many things to render. That can all be reduced and improved upon, but that's going to take a lot of time for them to do post-release. So as of right now, I believe that is still an issue. I'm almost positive that is still an issue. Particle effects. They have a lot of exploding organic matter throughout the levels, and they have a lot of really cool looking clouds in the same stylized effect. One of the bosses in particular, I think his name was the Scourge. Actually, it was the Scourge. He would do an explosion move where a skull of poison would come out of his body, and it would shoot these like little flying... I don't even know how to describe these things. It was almost like you had like leaves that were chopped into tiny pieces, and then they were turned into projectiles with some glowing ambiance around them, and those were shot out of you. But the initial particle effect was really cool looking with the skull, the poison skull coming out of his body. And it was something that unless you looked right at the boss when he decided to use that move, you wouldn't notice, and I remember specifically that was really cool. So the particle effects all throughout the game were pretty solid. Even on the final boss, the Dreamer, they had a great particle effect. A lot of the weapons have great particle effects. The mods look great. And that is going to lead me into weapon styles. I think the weapon styles looked really good too. Now, in the beginning, I think a few of them were kind of basic. They gave you like a basic shotgun, and they give you like a basic pistol. But overall, when you start adding these boss mods to them, the tip of your pistol's got like this green glowing lantern on it, or your guy adds like some fire mod and all of a sudden there's a ton of tape all over your gun. They did a really good job of adding a ton of different animation styles, and weapon styles onto the guns themselves, and I thought they did a pretty good job with that. Now, the boss weapons themselves, can you compare the weapons to that of like a Destiny 2? And the answer is no, you can't. The weapons aren't going to be like so over the top with glowing ambient particle effects and all of these different like textures and just glowing armor. You're not going to be able to match a game of that magnitude with Remnant from the Ashes. You're just not going to be able to. But for the amount of weapons they had in the game, the amount of different styles they gave you, I was decently satisfied. I would have appreciated a few more weapons in the game. I feel like the playthrough was a bit linear in regards to the weapons they would give you, until you got the unique boss weapons. But then you really had to commit to a boss weapon, and you wouldn't even know if you actually liked it or not, which could be an issue. The VFX, the actual animations for the weapons, I thought were great. Like I said before, the fire mod was awesome. You could shoot like a spore root into the ground that would sprout a root that would take like 275 damage before it would be destroyed. That mod looked awesome. There were a ton of different mods that would shoot electricity, and they did a really good job of staying on par with the particle effects and the animations in the graphics sector. Now, let's move on to gameplay. This is the most important thing for me, to be honest. I am of an old school generation. I don't care about graphics like almost at all. So if the gameplay is slightly off to me, that is what's going to get under my skin and piss me off. And so let's go through it here. Character movement, moving left and right, forward and backwards. I had a slight issue in the beginning of playing the game with the running animation. It looked like my guy was moving his shoulders to the left and the right more than he should be for a normal run animation. It almost looked like my guy was like a goofball that never learned how to run fast enough, like he wasn't an athlete or something. But he was forced into this post-apocalyptic era, and somehow he's going to be the savior, but the guy doesn't even know how to run correctly. So that annoyed me a little bit, but that doesn't affect gameplay. That's just like my character's running animation. But the character movement, I think, was fine. I would get a little caught up with my guy. After I would dodge, you had to hit the run button, clicking in your left joystick, almost like at the perfect time for your guy to start running directly out of a dodge. Whereas like in Dark Souls, you press circle and then hold down circle after you did the initial dodge, and your guy just runs right out of it, which is, I think, like if I dodge and then hit the button at any point in time to run, mid-dodge, my guy should automatically go into a run. So that gameplay error, in my opinion, I think that's an error. That annoyed me. Now, the biggest gripe I have in the gameplay of this game, aside from like the actual things that they decided to put into the game in regards to like Gears of War has cover, and other games use different things like movement speed and first person, and like those are just like game design decisions. We're not going to really go into those that much. I'm talking about like what the game was how the game was actually designed and built, but they have issues with the current systems that they implemented, the existing framework. Now, what's bothering me with the existing framework was that the Deadzone on the controllers was really bad. Now, in my Dreamer video, at the end of the game, I went through this a little bit specifically with you guys. But basically, the Deadzone is a 0 to 1 value, where 0 means you're not going to move the cursor in the middle of the screen to aim your gun at all, and a 1 value means you're going to aim your gun as fast as possible. Now, the Deadzone range was about 40%, meaning you could move the joystick axis in any direction about 40% before your character would move or aim in any direction. Now, that is far too high for me, because if you like to subtly aim your gun, so say you're aiming at the guy's neck, but you're not getting headshots, and you just need to move a tiny ink above to shoot the guy in the face, but you can't move that joystick until you hit the 40% threshold, they make you go from shooting him in the neck to missing his head entirely, because then the joystick moves so fast because the Deadzone isn't correctly calibrated. And that Deadzone issue, I would actually give him, I wouldn't even give him a B, I would give him a C. Like, that's a massive flaw to me in regards to gameplay. Now, aside from that, I think if we go into what they actually instilled into the game itself, I think not having Hipfire or cover in the game like Gears of War was a big mistake. For this type of game, getting in people's faces and needing to dodge immediately and always getting out of sticky situations, having no form of Hipfire was really lame. It doesn't allow you to just like blast a few times and then dodge and get out of a sticky situation. Also, a few of the bosses would use cover to their advantage, and they would duck behind cover and they would shoot at you, but you had no form of getting into cover and then shooting back. Cover would have been appreciated for me in this type of game specifically. There's 3 different weapon types. You have a short-ranged, a medium-ranged, and a long-ranged weapon. Those weapons are all very specific. So the short-ranged weapon is a shotgun, and the shotgun is great in close encounters, as you would expect it to be. The medium-ranged weapon is almost like a battle rifle type assault rifle weapon that you can start with. And that's also a really good weapon for almost any circumstance. The long-ranged weapon is really good from, far distances. But from what I found playing through the game, that's just too brief of a description. The short-ranged weapon is great up close, but it really stinks from far, and it's quite terrible. And the medium-range weapon is good in all circumstances, and to be honest, the long-range weapon's pretty good in all circumstances too. The only weapon that you can't get addicted to is the shotgun, or any weapon that has a range that is below like 10 meters, because if an enemy is far away and you're trying to shoot them, you're just not going to do enough damage, and they punish you for this. So I played as the Scrapper, and the Scrapper is the class that starts with the shotgun, and it penalized me in the later stages of the game and actually caused me to have to farm a different item entirely to beat the final boss, because my shotgun was so weak against the final boss. It was quite pathetic. And then I realized, okay, well, that's just a total design flaw in the shotgun itself. If you shoot a real-life shotgun, it's not like you have a lethal range and a not lethal range 2 meters apart, 5 meters apart. You can shoot shotgun shells and shoot a skeet in the middle of the air 40 yards away from you and hit it no problem. Shotguns actually do damage from far away. So the short-range shotgun losing its effectiveness past like 10 meters I thought was kind of garbage. The mods on the guns was actually a really cool idea. This is something that I liked a lot. So you could modify your guns after you accrued a certain amount of modification power from fighting enemies with a certain type of gun. so that you could shoot fire out of your barrel along with the bullets, or you could shoot poison out of the gun, or whatever you want it to be. And the mods allow you to customize your playthrough so you can unleash really devastating and powerful effects all throughout your run. Now, the mods are something you don't want to rely on all the time, because if you're using mods 24/7 and then you're in a tight spot and you don't have a mod, then you're screwed. So I think learning how to utilize your weapons first and then mods second is probably best nature. Resistances are an interesting mechanic in the game. There's like 10 different resistances. You have bleed resistance, you have radiation resistance, you have flame resistance, and in these different resistances, if you fight somebody that has a ton of bleed damage and you don't have any bleed resistance, you end up taking a lot of damage from it and accruing the bleed status a lot faster. So paying attention to your resistances on your armor is something that you need to do, which could be a little overbearing for new players. It was for me, at least at first. So the RPG mechanics of the game that I think is probably the third most important thing is the mods and the resistances can get a little overwhelming, but you need to pay attention to them to make sure you know what you're doing and you're going to succeed. So the mods on the weapons, in one particular boss fight, I believe it was called the Risen. I was really struggling to get past the Risen because they wouldn't stop spawning these ads on. And when I say ads, I mean in a boss fight, if enemies keep spawning, they're just known as ads, add-ons. So these ads kept spawning, and I decided to put onto one of my weapons the Spore mod. And when I get enough modification power on my weapon, I can shoot a spore onto the ground, and that will allow the enemies to attack the spore instead of my character, because for some reason it draws aggravation levels from the enemies to want to attack my spore instead of attacking my character, allowing me to move around freely, at least temporarily. Now, I defeated the Risen like 2 tries after learning this. So RPG mechanics, the mods are very, very important to pay attention to. So you can't just use one mod the whole game and think you're good, easy peasy. You need to learn how all the mods work, and that can take a little bit of time for you to learn. The resistances are definitely a little bit of a pain because they can exploit certain types of armors. So when you upgrade your armors, you get an armor value, which actually prevents physical damage that you take, but then it comes along with resistances to the elements. Now, if you have your armor upgraded to +10 and your next strongest armor is +2, but the armor that's +2 has a ton of bleed resistance, and you don't have any bleed resistance on your armor that's +10, you might actually find yourself in a circumstance where it's more beneficial for you to just wear the +10 armor and just get hit by the bleed every single time, because you're going to end up getting shredded if you have no armor. So the RPG mechanics in the resistances can be frustrating because sometimes you almost need to balance 2 sets of armor as well. The traits. This is something that is very important, is in this game, you'll find yourself eating and chewing through so many different healing items just to stay alive in the beginning. And that's probably the most Dark Souls-esque thing about this entire game, is just how brutal the initial drop-in of the game is, to be honest. So you need to upgrade a couple of different traits when you start your character and start leveling up, and I would say it's most important to just upgrade raw health in the beginning just so you don't die, so you can just keep progressing your file. So but there are a lot of other traits that you need to pay attention to. Ones that increase the amount of resources you find, one that increases the amount of experience you gain, others increase your stamina, resistances, mod power growth, a ton of different things. But it's the same as mods and resistances. You need to be very strategic, and you have to plan for the future of what you want your traits to actually do and achieve for you. Now you got weapon upgrades and armor upgrades. Now these are pretty self-explanatory. You upgrade your weapon, it does more damage. You upgrade your armor, it has more armor. So that's pretty easy for everybody to understand, and that's a standard RPG mechanic in most games. I don't think there's any way that it really stands out in this game compared to any other games. It's kind of the same deal. You find the resources that you need through your playthrough, and then as you grab those resources, you you know, put those resources, you know, to the blacksmith, and the blacksmith forges the weapons for you and increases them in effectiveness. Enemy weaknesses. So there are weak spots on the bosses and a lot of the enemies that you fight. It's a simple headshot mechanic. Shoot him in the head, he takes more damage. But in this game, it's not necessarily headshots all the time. Sometimes they have like a weak arm or a weak leg or something. That's another thing that you want to pay attention to, as enemy weak spots is definitely a thing. And you can tell that you're hitting an enemy in a weak spot because the combat text will turn to orange when you hit them in one of those specific spots. So, factoring in gameplay, RPG mechanics, and graphics, I would say that this game gets a solid B+, or maybe a B. It's between a B and a B+. I really did enjoy all of what the game had to offer, all of the bosses and everything. I think if we talk a little further, we have to discuss still sound quality, difficulty, and the game design. So I think if we talk about game design right now, the level generation is something I'm not a huge fan of, and that is procedural generation. Procedural generation basically means that if a level was created by code and it was not pre-created, and that creates some environments that are just really brutal for the players to go through, and other times it creates environments that are not that difficult for the player to encounter and go through, and it at times could just create a situation where it's just punishing and unfair for the player if he's playing by himself. So, for example, on one of my playthroughs, I was about halfway through the game, I was in the middle of ROM, and there was an area where they put 4 elites almost directly on top of each other, and I had to take them all out. I had no healing items, I was running low on bullets, and that was one of those moments where I barely escaped and got out of the situation, but I think it was because I was a little powerful for the area. And if I wasn't powerful for the area and say I was under-leveled when I got to that specific point in the game, I would have definitely died. Now, the next time I loaded back into that zone, I may not have ran into all of those guys clumped into the same area, but the fact that that exists as a possibility is one of the negatives of procedurally generated levels. And that's specifically why I don't like them. I understand in theory why they're better. You're not going to run into the same situation every single time, so you can't memorize the game. But let's be honest, Dark Souls, Bloodborne, Demon Souls, even Dark Souls 3, Dark Souls 2, all of those games were pre-generated by hand, were not done procedurally, and those are some of the best games I've ever played. And yeah, you can memorize the encounters, but by coding the enemies so aggressively and increasing the AI of the enemies to such a degree that it even parts coming up after I've beaten the game 5 times I'm gonna encounter again can still instill fear in me because the enemies are so difficult and over the top. And that's one of the things that people call this like a Dark Souls like game, and it's like, well, I got hit 7 times and didn't die. Name a Bloodborne game or a Dark Souls 3 game that I can get hit 7 times and not die if I didn't upgrade my health and only my health and increase all my armor to the max stats without upgrading my weapons. It would never happen. So that is a negative, in my opinion, to Remnant from the Ashes, is that the levels can be unfair sometimes, and it's not because the enemies are overly coded and the AI's really smart and the actual encounters are tough. It's that the poor level design actually leaves a million enemies for you to deal with, and that causes you to actually have unfair encounters that aren't game combat design choices. So one is just being punished with too many enemies, one is you just not being good enough to actually beat the game. The one where you're not good enough to beat the game is Bloodborne. The one where you just get punished unfairly is Remnant from the Ashes, and that happens in Dead Cells as well. And then the cool things about procedural generation are chests and random drops throughout levels. That's a really cool thing, is that you can find random chests and simulacrums that increase your health items, like Estus shards in Dark Souls. You can find those throughout the levels and they're never in the same spot, so it does make exploring a bit more fun. I will give it that. Sound quality, I think the voice acting and the background music was really good.
It's you, the one who washed ashore. We see all things. We are the Root Mother, a vessel of...
The Devourer lurks unchecked. The labyrinth erodes daily, and I can behold the tide. On the other hand, your journey is not guaranteed to finish.
Great King! I did not expect... You?
I've heard from other people that they had some bugs with the sound quality in the game, but I actually never experienced any of those. I don't even think we should really go into the sound quality that deeply because I experienced nothing that bothered me. I never heard two animation sounds happen at the same time. I never had any issues with the music being too loud. I thought all the voice acting was really solid. The background music versus the battle music was good. The only music in the entire game I didn't like was the Ward 13 bass music they would play in the background. It was a bit too dreary for me. It seemed very sad and I don't know. I understand that they're kind of at the end of the world and that's the kind of what they're trying to paint for us is that they're all in a really tough spot and I get that. But when you're just trying to upgrade your guy and everyone's in a bad mood, it's kind of like, I would rather have at least a couple of people be upbeat and be like, let's get them, let's go guys, come on, we can do this. Like, that's kind of how Gears of War was. Like, Gears of War was the end of the world too, but not everyone was so down and dreary, and it just started to annoy me after a while. In difficulty, we go into difficulty, I think that the game is difficult more often than not based on unfair circumstances compared to enemies being coded really well. There was an enemy that digs underneath the ground in Corsus that when he gets close to you leaps out of the ground and attacks you, and I found that if you dodge towards him, he delays jumping out of the ground even though he's close enough to jump out of the ground, turns his character model, and still hits you if you dodge towards him, which I think is totally atrocious. So they didn't want you dodging towards him, they wanted you dodging to the left or the right when he was gonna come at you. Which I thought was extremely stupid and wasn't coded correctly. And I feel like you'll find a couple of things like that throughout the game where you're like, oh, yeah, I don't know if that was hard for the right reasons. That was just hard just almost to be hard. And that's when frustration can kick in. I think most of the bosses were actually pretty solid. There were a couple of enemies throughout the game that did get a bit annoying, but overall, I think the bosses were really solid. They did a really good job at adding, like I explained before, adds into the boss fight that would create a sense of chaos. You had to control all the adds and the boss at the same time, which really left you, looking down every nook and cranny to figure out how to defeat the enemy, and I thought they did a really solid job with all the bosses in the game. The enemies would interact with the environment and use cover, which I thought was really cool. So the AI on not every enemy, but on, I would say, about like 80% of the enemies was actually pretty solid. When I say that there were enemies that would frustrate you based on unfair gameplay mechanics that they had into this game, it was only a tiny amount. It was only about like 10-15% of the enemies. It was not the majority of the game, because if it was, I would not have beaten this game. I think certain encounters would require you to rework your mod. Like I was explaining before, the Risen needed the Spore mod instead of, I would think I was using like the Fire mod. And I think that's okay. It would be a little annoying. It might be daunting for new players because they would be like, well, I never even thought to change my mod on this fight. I was using it before and it was working well for me. You just have to be adaptable in all circumstances. And then my last pointer I want to make is don't fall in love with any one weapon. I used the shotgun throughout my entirety of the playthrough, except for the final boss. I had to farm my rifle, and it really annoyed me that I had to do that and they didn't allow the shotgun to get the job done at the end. I'm sure if I practiced for a day straight, I could have done it with the shotgun, but I didn't want to practice for a full day to defeat a boss I could defeat in 3 attempts if I had the correct gun. I think that's ridiculous, and that, in my opinion, is a flaw. So, if we go through Remnant of the Ashes, as a whole, everything being included, sound quality, gameplay, RPG mechanics, difficulty, graphics, and game design, I would give this game a B to B+. That's where I'm leaving it. I would not wait for a sale. I would go out and buy this game right now. I don't think there's that many bugs in the game. I saw a review where some guy said there were a ton of bugs. If you look at the date that came out, that was on August 20th. It is September 5th right now. There are not that many bugs, and this game was a really solid endeavor. I enjoyed the playthrough. There were only a couple of things that bothered me, namely the Deadzone that bothered me the most on the left joystick and the right joysticks. Those annoyed me the most. But aside from that, this is a solid game. You're going to get a ton of time out of it, and for the $40 price tag, you honestly can't go wrong. So, again, if you guys are liking the content that I'm producing, comment, like, and subscribe to my YouTube channel. You'll find me on Twitter and Instagram at GamerDevTim, and you guys are also welcome to join me on Discord. I would love to talk further with all of you, and I look forward to delivering some more awesome videos. I'll catch everybody later. See ya. Bye.